Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're covering something that's been weighing heavy on a lot of hearts, and I want to approach this with the respect and sensitivity it deserves. What happened on December 18th wasn't just another aviation incident. 7 lives were lost, including an entire family, and the ripple effects of this tragedy are going to be felt for years to come by friends, family, and everyone who knew these incredible people. Just over a week ago, audio recordings started making their way around the aviation community. And honestly, I've spent countless hours analyzing every single word, every pause, every background sound in these transmissions. What we're about to discuss isn't just data and technical analysis. These are the final communications from people fighting desperately to save their aircraft and everyone on board. So before we get into the details, I want you to understand that behind every piece of information we discussed today, there were real people, good people, trying their absolute best in an impossible situation. On that Wednesday morning in North Carolina, a Cessna Citation 550 lifted off from Statesville Regional Airport with 7 souls on board. Greg Biffle, a name many of you will recognize from NASCAR, was traveling with his wife Christina and their 2 children. They were heading down to Florida for an event before continuing on to the Bahamas, a place the family loved and where they'd actually built their own private island home. Also on board were Dennis Dutton, a 67-year-old retired airline captain with decades of experience, his son Jack, who was working on his pilot's license, and the aircraft was being operated under Part 91, which means this was private operation, not a charter flight. Now I actually had the privilege of meeting Greg and Christina about a year and a half ago in the Bahamas at Spanish Key. We hung out at the yacht club, had some drinks, and I can tell you firsthand, they were genuinely wonderful people. What you saw on television, that's exactly who they were in real life. No pretense, no celebrity attitude, just down-to-earth, kind, fun people. Christina even reached out when I was back in the islands this past June, inviting me to check out their private island, even though they weren't going to be there. That's just the kind of generous spirit they had. And Greg's humanitarian work, especially during the hurricane disasters in North Carolina, flying his personal helicopter to deliver supplies to people who desperately needed them, that tells you everything about who this man was. So let's talk about what actually happened that morning. The weather conditions were what we call marginal VFR, which needs some explanation for those not familiar with aviation terminology. VFR stands for Visual Flight Rules, meaning pilots are navigating primarily by looking outside and referencing the ground, airports, and visual landmarks. This is different from IFR, or Instrument Flight Rules, which is how almost all commercial airline flights operate, where you're relying on instruments and GPS guidance systems. Marginal VFR means you've got maybe 3 to 5 miles of visibility and cloud ceilings hanging around 1,000 to 1,200 feet above the ground. It's still legal to fly, absolutely, but there's significantly less margin for error. If you climb above that cloud deck, you can lose sight of the airport really quickly, and suddenly you're in a situation where getting back down safely becomes complicated. The Citation 550 took off normally from runway 10, climbed to approximately 200 feet, and then something went wrong. The ADS-B data, which tracks aircraft position and altitude, shows they lost some altitude briefly, then climbed back up before making the decision to return to the airport. Now here's where things get interesting from a procedural standpoint. They initially appeared to line up for a landing back on runway 10, the same runway they'd just departed from, but for reasons we're still trying to understand, they didn't commit to that approach. Instead, they executed what's called a teardrop maneuver, basically a tight turning pattern to reposition themselves to land on runway 28, which is the opposite direction. This is where the audio becomes absolutely critical to understanding their situation. We have 3 separate radio transmissions, and I want to walk you through each one carefully because the details matter tremendously here. Keep in mind these calls are being made on the Unicom frequency, which is essentially an open channel where pilots at uncontrolled airports communicate their intentions to each other. There's no air traffic controller to ask questions, provide guidance, or coordinate emergency services. It's just pilots talking to other pilots. The first transmission goes like this. Listen to that carefully. He identifies the aircraft, Cessna 257 Bravo Whiskey, and immediately states they've got an issue with some of their things. Now I've got to tell you, after listening to this literally hundreds of times, that phrasing troubles me. Some of their things. That's incredibly vague. In aviation, Especially in emergency situations, specificity can be the difference between life and death. If you're talking to air traffic control and you declare an emergency, the controller is immediately going to ask you to state the nature of your emergency. A trained pilot, especially someone with thousands of hours like Dennis Dutton had from his airline career, would typically respond with something very specific. Engine failure number 2. Hydraulic system failure. Flight control problems. Something concrete that tells everyone exactly what you're dealing with. But here's something else that's really caught my attention, and the attention of many other aviation professionals who've analyzed this audio. Listen to the voice. To my trained ear, and I've spent my entire career listening to radio communications in all kinds of conditions, this sounds like a young voice. This doesn't sound like a 67-year-old retired airline captain. It sounds like someone much younger, possibly in their 20s or 30s. Now, we know Jack Dutton, Dennis's son, was on board, and he was a student pilot. Student pilots are absolutely trained on radio communications, and whoever is speaking sounds relatively confident in their delivery. But the terminology, the lack of specificity, that suggests someone without extensive experience in high-pressure emergency situations. If Dennis Dutton was at the controls, and logically he should have been, because he was the only person on that aircraft with a type rating for the Citation 5850, why isn't he making these calls? It's possible, of course, that he's completely absorbed in trying to fly the airplane, dealing with whatever emergency they're facing, and he's delegated radio communications to his son in the right seat. That would actually make sense from a crew resource management standpoint. But it also means the person communicating with the outside world doesn't have the experience to articulate exactly what's happening, which might explain why we're getting these vague references to issues and things. The second transmission comes after they've turned back toward the airport. Now we're getting some actionable information. They're configuring the aircraft for landing, which means they're extending the landing gear and lowering the flaps. This is standard procedure when you're preparing to land. But here's the critical issue. If they're dealing with an engine failure, and that's looking increasingly likely based on everything we're seeing, getting fully configured with gear and flaps extended is actually working against them in a major way. The Citation 550 has a nickname in the aviation community. It's called the Slowtation. That's not meant as an insult, it's just a recognition of the aircraft's design characteristics. It has a straight-edged wing, which is fantastic for maneuverability. You can turn this thing on a dime, but that straight-edged wing design creates significantly more drag than a swept-wing aircraft, especially when you're operating on a single engine. Now add extended landing gear and flaps, and you've multiplied that drag dramatically. The one functioning engine is screaming at full power. The pilot is pushing hard on the rudder pedals to counteract the asymmetric thrust, and the aircraft is fighting you every inch of the way. Here's what really concerns me about their flight path. When they turned back, they executed this teardrop maneuver that appears way too tight based on the ADS-B tracking data. Compare the lazy wide turn they made when they initially took off to the sharp, aggressive turn they're making back toward runway 28. That tells me they're low, they're slow, they're fully configured, and they're fighting for every bit of performance they can squeeze out of that aircraft. The NTSB made a statement that the aircraft was stable on approach, and I've got to respectfully question that assessment. To me, stable means you're on the correct glide path, you're at the appropriate speed, and you're lined up with the runway centerline. By all those measures, this approach was anything but stable. There's a rule of thumb in aviation for calculating your descent path. For every mile from the runway, you should be at 300 feet of altitude. So 1 mile out, you're at 300 feet. 2 miles out, 600 feet. 3 miles out, 900 feet. That gives you a nice, stable 3-degree glide slope into the runway. The last ADS-B reading we have shows them at approximately 1 mile out, traveling at 106 knots. They should have been at 300 feet. Instead, they hit the approach lights, which are way below that altitude. They were low and they were slow, and in aviation, that combination is absolutely deadly. You don't have the altitude to recover, and you don't have the airspeed to trade for altitude if you need it. The third and final transmission is heartbreaking in its brevity. That's it. That's the last thing anyone hears from that aircraft. They've committed to runway 28. They're on final approach, meaning the runway is directly in front of them, and they're trying desperately to get this airplane on the ground. But gravity and physics don't care about intentions. With all that drag, insufficient power, low altitude, and low airspeed, they simply ran out of options. They struck the approach lighting system, continued onto the runway already engulfed in flames, and that's where the aircraft came to rest. Now let's talk about something that's going to be crucial to the investigation. This aircraft did not have a flight data recorder, which isn't required for Part 91 operations of this size. However, it did have a cockpit voice recorder because at some point in its history, this citation had been operated under Part 135, which is air charter operations, and those regulations required the CVR installation. That cockpit voice recorder is going to tell investigators almost everything they need to know. They'll hear every conversation, every warning alarm, every sound in that cockpit. They'll know exactly what emergency the crew was dealing with, what actions they took, and what their thought process was throughout this entire sequence. Additionally, this aircraft was equipped with a Garmin avionics suite, and here's where we might get really lucky from an investigative standpoint. Those Garmin systems have SD cards that record flight data. Now, these aren't designed to survive impacts and fires the way a proper flight data recorder is, but if enough of that computer system survived and they can extract that SD card, it's essentially going to give them a flight data recorder's worth of information. Engine parameters, airspeed, altitude, control inputs, everything. The NTSB has recovered what's left of that Garmin system, and they're attempting to pull the data from it right now. What we're looking at timeline-wise is a preliminary report within the next month. That report will give us the basic facts: who was sitting where, what the crew qualifications were, what the cockpit voice recorder revealed, and if they're lucky, what the Garmin data showed. That preliminary report usually gives us a pretty clear picture of what happened. Then, anywhere from 12 to 18 months from now, we'll get the final comprehensive report that goes into excruciating detail about every single factor that contributed to this accident. Here's what keeps running through my mind as I analyze all of this. Why didn't they just fly straight ahead? That's what airline pilots are trained to do when you have an emergency right after takeoff. Level the wings, establish a positive rate of climb, get above the weather, get the airplane cleaned up, and then assess your situation. A citation. 550 will absolutely fly on one engine. It's not going to climb spectacularly, but it'll fly. Get up above that broken cloud layer at 1,200 feet, get into clear air where you can see, engage the autopilot to reduce workload, and then make a plan. Maybe fly down to Charlotte, where there's a long runway, full emergency services, and air traffic controllers who can help coordinate everything. But they didn't do that. They turned back almost immediately. That suggests to me that whatever was happening in that cockpit felt immediately life-threatening. Maybe the engine wasn't just failing, maybe it was coming apart violently, creating massive vibration and potentially a fire risk. Maybe there were multiple failures happening simultaneously. The audio uses the word issues, plural, multiple times. Maybe it wasn't just one thing going wrong. Maybe the cargo door opened, luggage came out, and simultaneously they had an engine problem. Or maybe warning lights were illuminating across the panel, and they just didn't know what was happening. So the instinctive response was to get this airplane back on the ground as quickly as possible. I keep thinking about what must have been going through everyone's minds in that cockpit. Dennis Dutton, if he was flying, had spent his entire career in aviation, thousands upon thousands of hours. He'd dealt with emergencies before. He'd trained for scenarios like this in the simulator. But simulator training and real-world emergencies with your family sitting behind you are two completely different experiences. The pressure, the stress, the sheer terror of knowing that your son is next to you. Your friends are behind you, and you're fighting for all of their lives. And Jack, sitting in that right seat, doing everything he can to help his father, making these radio calls, probably managing checklists, trying to be useful even though he doesn't have anywhere near the experience needed for a situation like this. And Greg and Christina and their children, sitting in the back, probably initially thinking this is just a minor issue, the pilots will sort it out. We'll land back at Statesville and figure out what happened. Then gradually realizing as the airplane is maneuvering aggressively, as they hear the strain in the voices from the cockpit, that this is serious. That text message that apparently went out, we're having an emergency landing. Someone knew. Someone understood they were in real trouble. The thing about aviation accidents is that they're almost never just one thing. There's a concept called the error chain, and it's usually a series of small decisions or circumstances that link together to create a catastrophic outcome. Maybe the weather was just bad enough that they should have waited another hour. Maybe the maintenance records will show something that was overlooked. Maybe the decision to turn back instead of flying straight ahead was the critical error. Maybe being single pilot with only a student pilot as backup meant there wasn't enough experience in that cockpit to manage this particular emergency. We won't know until the investigation is complete. What we do know is that 7 incredible people are gone. An entire family wiped out in an instant. A father and son who shared a passion for aviation, gone together. And the world lost some genuinely good people. Greg Biffle's legacy of helping others, of giving back to his community, of being a real person despite his fame, that's what we should remember. Christina's kindness and generosity, the lives they touched, and the people they helped. That's what matters. The preliminary report will come out soon, and we'll cover it here on the channel. We'll have answers to a lot of the questions we're asking today, but those answers won't bring anyone back. They'll just help us understand what happened and hopefully prevent something similar from happening again. That's the purpose of these investigations. Not to assign blame, but to learn, to improve, to make aviation safer for everyone. If you found this analysis helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the follow-up when the NTSB releases their findings. And please, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this respectful, keep it focused on the facts and the aviation aspects of what happened. These families are grieving, and the last thing they need is speculation or insensitivity. Thanks for watching, everyone, and remember, every time you fly, every time you make a decision in the cockpit, you're not just responsible for yourself. You're responsible for everyone who trusts you with their lives. Fly safe out there.